Hello and welcome. In this video, I will talk about the steps in outcome harvesting. So this is the overview of outcome harvesting process. You see the 5 steps, starting with designing the harvest, identifying, formulating the outcomes, finalizing the outcome statement, analyzing, reflect, learn, and adapt. And separately, there is the substantiation. So substantiation, usually in evaluation process, it will be in the step between 3 and 4. So just after finalizing outcome statements and before analysis. But when using outcome harvesting for monitoring, then the substantiation have more flexibility in terms of when that process will happen. So that's why substantiation here is next to the 5 main steps, because it can come in between different steps. So I will dive more into each of these steps as well as substantiation throughout the video. The first step is designing the harvest itself. So this part is very utilization focused. So here the focus is on who should be involved in this project and how should their involvement be in which stage of the harvest and why. So really thinking through the design of it. And what's also important from the start is to identify outcome harvesting ambassadors. So these are the people who are very enthusiastic about the methodology, or who you can mobilize to drive the process of outcome harvesting within the organization. So these are outcome harvesting allies and drivers. And something else to consider is how do we roll out the outcome harvesting methodology? And when doing so, do we harvest outcomes online or offline throughout the program period? So maybe you want to start off the methodology with a face-to-face workshop or an offline workshop where you introduce the methodology and where you start harvesting together with the team. And here it's also worth considering who should be in the room and how to set it up. And there is a separate video on facilitation of outcome harvesting workshops for this. And also how to document the outcomes is something that you can think about on the initial basis. So do you already want to create a database, maybe a box structure where the outcomes can be submitted, or maybe using database as cognito forms, or is it simply submitting the harvested outcomes in Word documents? So these are relevant questions to ask. And also importantly, what is the use of the outcome? So do you want to use them at a later point for as data for midterm evaluation, for final evaluation, or for learning? And how do you integrate it into these processes? And yes, so these are some of the questions for the first part. And the second part, the second step, is to identify and formulate outcomes. So after this step, you will have the preliminary descriptions of draft outcome statements. And this step consists of the change, its relevance, and your contribution. So this is when you identify the outcomes. And most likely, you will come together with the project team either through an outcome harvesting workshop, or maybe for a lighter session brainstorm, where you brainstorm together on the outcomes. And throughout the project, it can also be that harvester individually identify these challenges, these changes, and the contribution. And also we have the harvesters here. So these are the people who are most knowledgeable about the change that happened. So anyone that are involved within the project. And this process is suggested to take place in cooperation with the team. So as I mentioned before, you might want to come together, either doing sessions or workshops. And that's because you might not have all outcomes in mind as one person. So together you might help each other to remember what are the changes, and maybe you have identified a change but don't have all the information about how it came about, what the contribution was. So then team members, project members can help filling in that type of information. And here it's also important to already think about evidence, what type of sources and documentation can be attached to these outcomes to verify that the change indeed happened, as well as the contribution took place. And then the third step is finalizing the outcomes. So here we will, after this step, have final verifiable outcomes and outcome statements. So this is in finalizing the outcomes, there's a ping-ponging where quality assessment and assurance is happening. So this is a review phase where typically a focal point, who could be the mill officer, reviewing the outcome statements to check, okay, are there any questions that are still remaining, any information that is lacking in the statement. It could also be a peer-to-peer review, that you come together with your colleagues to review each other's outcome statements to make sure that it's understandable for someone who is outside of the project or someone who didn't write the outcome statement. It's him or herself. And once the statement is completed, then either the mill officer or the project manager, so the final focal point, can approve the outcome. And the fourth step is the analysis. So here we analyze the outcomes that has been collected. And the main questions to ask here is what has been achieved and how. So looking at all of the outcomes that have been collected, what was the change that happened, and also where has change not happened and why is that. So here you can categorize the outcomes in different levels, or based on social actors, or whether the change took place on local or national, regional, or global level. So these are ways to understand the change that happened. And there is also a separate video on the analysis part where I will dive more into detail on examples of how to do this analysis. And the fifth step is reflect, learn, and adapt. So here we really want to make use of that information and make use of those findings that emerge from the harvested outcomes to reflect and learn. So what does this tell us about, for instance, our theory of change? What does it tell us about our interventions? And then how can we use this to adapt and inform the programming? So is there any strategies that we see work better, that contributed to more outcomes? And that might mean that in the planning, you want to adapt certain interventions that work with, that maybe didn't work so well, and also increase interventions that you see were effectful. And finally, substantiation, which is, as I mentioned, a process that can take part in different phases. So substantiation is a verification of the outcomes. So this is a process where a selection of outcomes are taken to verify the accuracy and deepen our understanding for the credibility of these outcomes. And here, typically, it would be an independent and external person doing this substantiation. So it can be, for instance, that we want to outsource the substantiation process, doing the midterm review or final evaluation to an external consultant. And doing the substantiation, this independent external person will then interview or check with different sources to check with people who are knowledgeable about the project, but outside of the project, whether this change actually happened. And in terms of availability and willingness to contribute, then these people who are knowledgeable about the project, but outside of projects. So that could, for instance, be if the change is that a minister has, for the first time, acknowledged during a public speech that there is need of more inclusive peace practices. Then that people outside of the project who are knowledgeable about this change could be the minister itself. It could also be journalists who were present at this speech, who was maybe even interviewing the minister. So these then you need to consider, or the external substantiator need to consider, okay, what is the availability and willingness to contribute to this substantiation? So the minister might have less availability, and it might be more likely that some of the journalists will be available and willing to take part of this substantiation. All right, so just a bit more of a dive into the substantiation, as this process is need a bit more of elaboration. Then the theoretical definition of substantiation is the confirmation of the substance of an outcome statement by someone knowledgeable about the outcome, but independent of the interventions that contributed to the change. So it's not the harvesters themselves who will take part of this confirmation process or substantiation process, but as mentioned, someone outside of the program who is not contracted by the program or implementing the interventions, but still knowledgeable about the changes that happened. So the substantiation aims to enhance the credibility of the data of the outcomes that has been harvested, and also enrich the understanding of the change and the dimensions of the change. And to substantiate the outcome statements, typically, as mentioned, testimonies and feedback are obtained from third parties, and with third parties here meaning someone outside of the program. And most often it will be difficult to verify all of the outcomes, because throughout the program period, you might have hundreds of outcomes. So you would want to select a sample to verify. And that sampling strategy can be maybe depending on whether there are some outcomes where the contribution is not so clear, or disagreement about the contribution to the outcome. Then these outcomes you might want to get through a substantiation process to understand them better. And also it can be that there are certain outcomes that are very important for the program, because they are directly within an area of change that are prioritized. So you might want to sample outcomes within that area. So that can be different strategies for how to sample the outcomes.